In the age of the Vikings, the world was bound by gods, both feared and worshipped. Odin, the All-Father, gave his eye for wisdom. Thor, with hammer in hand, guarded men with thunder and storm. Loki, the trickster, wove chaos into every fate. These were not distant deities, but forces felt in every battle, every harvest, every life. To understand the Vikings, you must first walk among their gods. Today, their myths and their truths will be revealed. The tale of Viking gods explained and more begins not with men, nor halls, nor the crash of oars upon the sea, but with silence older than breath. There was Ginnungagap, the yawning void, wide as eternity, deep as hunger, a chasm where nothing stirred. Yet in that vast nothingness, two forces gathered north. The breath of Niflheim, a world of mist and frost. South, the flames of Muspel, a land of fire and fury. When ice met flame, when frost kissed embers, the void itself quaked, and from the melt was born life. Not gentle life, but Ymir, the first giant, a being vast and terrible, his breath a storm, his sweat giving rise to more of his kind. He was not God, but something raw, something primal chaos clothed in flesh. From the rim of Niflheim, as the frost dripped, there came another miracle, a cow, Ordhumla, with teats, flowing rivers of milk, nourishing Ymir as he slumbered. But Ordhumla herself licked the salt-rimed stones, and from that labour the shape of another form emerged. Buri, tall and shining, the first of the gods. Through him a new line began, a line that would shape the destiny of all 9 realms. The clash of these two bloodlines, giant and god, was the first storm of the cosmos. For Ymir's offspring spread like weeds, vast and unruly, while Buri's kin sought order. It was Buri's grandson, Odin, alongside his brothers Vili and Ve, who looked upon the slumbering giant Ymir and saw not a father of worlds, but a threat that devoured space itself. So they struck him down. From Ymir's blood poured rivers that drowned his children, save a single frost giant who fled into darkness to father a brood of vengeance. From his bones the gods made mountains, from his flesh the earth, from his skull the dome of the sky, and from his hair the forests that whisper still. His blood became the seas where Viking ships would one day ride, oars slapping against waters born of death. Yet even in triumph the gods did not stand idle. They placed sparks from Muspel's realm into the vault of heaven, and thus the stars were kindled, cold fires guiding both beast and Viking man. They set Midgard as a fortress for mankind, girded by Ymir's brows, a world ring to keep out the devouring Jötnar. And to guard this fragile balance, Odin shaped the first humans from driftwood upon the shore, Ask and Embla breathing life into them with his own gift. These were not gods, nor giants, but mortal folk destined to toil, to feast, to bleed, and to raise children who would call upon the gods with mead and Viking food laid out in sacrifice. But Ginnungagap was never wholly tamed. In the roots of the great tree Yggdrasil, serpents stirred, and in the mountains of Jotunheim, the children of Ymir bided their time. For every act of creation was born of bloodshed, and the gods knew well that what is slain does not stay silent forever. The very sky above was stretched from the skin of a corpse, and the wind that filled a Viking sail was the sigh of a fallen giant. Still, from this grim birth, the order of worlds arose. Gods built their halls in Asgard, men lit fires in Midgard, and beneath the boughs of the world tree, the 9 realms took root. Every Viking child who heard this tale at the hearth knew the world itself was a battlefield, dressed as a home, born from violence, held by oaths, and fated to end as it began in fire and ice. Thus the beginning was not peace, but struggle, and the gods were not distant watchers, but kin of giants, drenched in blood, carving order from chaos with the edge of a blade. This was the true birth of the worlds, where the Viking gods first showed their might, and more the promise that every dawn was borrowed, every night a reminder, and every life a spark held between frost and flame. The tale of the 9 realms and the world tree is the tale of how the cosmos itself was bound together, each realm stitched like leaves to the mighty trunk of Yggdrasil. No Viking story begins without the whisper of this tree, for in its roots and branches lie the fate of gods, giants, men, and the dead alike. Yggdrasil was not planted by hand, nor grown by chance. It was the axis of existence, its roots gnawing deep into frost and shadow, its branches holding up the heavens, its trunk standing unbroken between all that ever was and all that ever shall be. High above, where the boughs brushed the stars, stood Asgard, the stronghold of the gods. Golden halls gleamed there, roofed with shields, ringed with spears, where Odin sat in Hillitskjalf watching over all. In Asgard, Thor's hammer rang, Freya's tears fell like gold, and warriors dreamed of Valhalla's endless feasts. It was the seat of order, where oaths bound men and gods alike, and where judgment was carried out not by words alone, but by the strike of lightning and spear. Below Asgard, resting in the middle branches of the world tree, stretched Midgard, the world of men. Protected by a wall of Ymir's brows, it was fragile yet stubborn, a land of toil and mead, of Viking children learning by the hearth, of Viking men sharpening steel by firelight, and Viking food simmering in pots as offerings to the gods. Midgard was the battlefield between chaos and order, where storms from Jotunheim raged across fields, and where men prayed to stand tall, though the blood of giants pulsed in their veins as surely as it did in the gods. Far beyond Midgard's wall, across seas of stone and ice, loomed Jotunheim, the land of the giants. Wild, vast, untamed, it was a place where mountains walked and rivers broke their banks with rage. Here dwelled the children of Ymir, cunning, brutal, and ancient. They were foes, yes, but also kin blood ties stretched between Asgard and Jotunheim like taut bowstrings. For many a god was sired by a union no oath could sanctify. To a Viking ear, Jotunheim was a warning. The wilderness always waits beyond the fence, watching, hungering. Beneath the roots of Yggdrasil lay Niflheim, realm of ice and mist, where frost never thawed and rivers hissed with venom. Here curled the serpent Nidhogg, gnawing at the roots, a reminder that even the mightiest tree carries doom in its marrow. In its mirror, far to the south, burned Muspelheim, a land of eternal flame, where Surt with his fire sword watched the horizon, waiting for the day when the sky itself would be torn apart by his blaze. Ice and fire, beginning and end, first breath and final scream. Helheim, the shadowed land of the dead, lay also in the roots, ruled by Hel, daughter of Loki, half fair and half rotten, her hall filled with those who died not in battle, but in straw beds or sickness. To a Viking, the thought was grim. Not all would reach Valhalla's joy. Many would find only Hel's cold welcome, their names whispered no longer in the halls of men. There was also Alfheim, home of the elves, bright and mysterious, who whispered in forests and stirred the dreams of men, and Svartalfheim, the realm of dwarfs, where smoke and sparks filled caverns, and hammers rang against stone, forging gifts the gods themselves prized. Vanaheim, homeland of the Vanir, still lay green and fertile, its people masters of Seidr, the deep magic of earth and harvest, forever bound to the Aesir by oaths made in blood. 9 realms, 9 threads, woven into Yggdrasil's vast tapestry. Yet they were not distant worlds, but neighbours bound by war, trade, kinship, and revenge. A Viking child hearing these tales knew his life was but one leaf trembling on that tree, and a Viking man raising his horn in sacrifice knew the gods themselves walked its boughs and feared its roots. For Yggdrasil was alive, watered by the well of Urd, guarded by the Norns, shaken by the trampling hooves of Heimdall's horned steeds, and bitten always by serpents in the dark. This was no idle map of worlds. It was the living spine of fate itself, and all who dwelt upon it, giant, god, or mortal, were bound together. The 9 realms and the world tree remind us that life is not still. It stretches, it groans, it breaks and grows again, and at its heart, the gods themselves tremble with the rest of us beneath its eternal shade. The saga of the Aesir and the Vanir is one of war, blood oaths, and uneasy kinship. A tale that echoes like the clang of iron across the halls of time. The Viking people did not see their gods as flawless beings of light, but as fierce powers who struggled, betrayed, and bargained as men did. Among the gods, there were 2 tribes, the Aesir and the Vanir, and though both claimed the heavens, their ways were as different as frost and flame. The Aesir were the gods of war, order, and ruling might. Odin, with his single eye and restless hunger for wisdom, led them from Asgard's shining halls. Thor, broad-shouldered and red-bearded, stood as their hammer and shield, while Tyr bound oaths with his sacrifice of hand. To Viking men, they were the guardians of battle, the keepers of law, and the bringers of storm. In their company, strength was tested, spears lifted, and the order of kin and king upheld. The Vanir were no less mighty, but their power lay in earth, sea, and harvest. Njord, lord of the sea's bounty, filled ships with fish and bellies with wealth. His children, Freya and Freyja, ruled over fertility, love, and plenty, and wielded a deeper magic, the Seither, that twisted fate and drew hidden knowledge from the threads of the Norns. To Viking farmers and seafarers, the Vanir were close as the soil beneath their feet, the waves beneath their ships, the harvest that filled Viking food bowls after long winters. When these 2 tribes met, there was no feast nor friendship at first. Distrust grew into insult, insult into war. The Aesir and the Vanir clashed with spears and fire, their battles shaking the 9 realms. Fields burned, halls fell, and neither side could claim victory. The Vanir's spells broke the Aesir's weapons, while the Aesir's strength shattered Vanir defences. For years they warred, and even the gods tasted hunger and grief. But war cannot last forever, even among immortals. At last, both sides wearied, and instead of endless blood, they chose truce. They spat into a great vessel, their mingled spittle forming a being unlike any other. Kvasir, wisest of all, who walked the realms teaching knowledge until treachery cut him down. His blood, mixed with honey, would later brew the mead of poetry, proof that even strife can give birth to beauty. To seal the peace, each side offered hostages, a mark of trust and binding. The Vanir sent Njord and his children, Freya and Freyja, to dwell among the Aesir, where they became beloved and honoured, their cult spreading far across Viking lands. In return, the Aesir gave Hoenir and Mimir, yet their gift was laced with cunning. Hoenir, tall and fair, seemed wise only when Mimir whispered counsel in his ear. When the Vanir discovered this deceit, they struck off Mimir's head and sent it back to Odin, who preserved it with magic, keeping the well of knowledge alive, though the body was gone. From that bitter trade, mistrust lingered, yet the tribes did not part again. They joined into one pantheon, their shrines rising side by side, their powers mingled. The Aesir's strength of war, the Vanir's gift of harvest, both worshipped by Viking men, women, and Viking children, who knew that life was not only spear and shield, but plough, grain, sea, and hearth. The war between the Aesir and Vanir taught that even gods bleed and bargain, that rivalries can be bound by oaths, though scars remain. It is the story of how 2 families, once divided, fused into one, and how the Viking people inherited a pantheon rich with both thunder and soil, blood and bread, spear and seed. From strife came unity, though uneasy, and from their mingling grew the faith that fed both warriors and farmers alike. Among all the gods, none burned brighter with hunger for knowledge than Odin the Seeker. To Viking men by the hearth and Viking children gathered close, he was not just a war god, nor merely the All-Father of Asgard. He was the wanderer cloaked in shadow, the relentless hunter of wisdom, who would pay any price, bear any wound, if it brought him closer to the secrets that bound the worlds. Power to Odin was not only the swing of a sword, but the truth hidden in whispers, in runes, in the dark places where even gods feared to walk. Odin was no king content to sit upon a throne and grow fat with comfort. His throne, Hlidskjalf, gave him sight across all the 9 realms, yet even this was not enough. He sought deeper truths, the roots beneath the tree, the fate that even the Norns themselves wove in silence. To quench this thirst, he rode far and wide, cloaked in the guise of a traveller, staff in hand, wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. Many a Viking man told of strangers who came unbidden to the hall, asking riddles, testing hospitality, only later revealed as Odin himself, measuring men as carefully as he measured gods. The greatest price he ever paid was for a single draught of wisdom. Beneath Yggdrasil's roots lay Mimir's well, where all the world's knowledge pooled, guarded by Mimir, whose wisdom was older than stone. Odin came to drink from it, but Mimir did not give freely. "A sacrifice," he said, "for wisdom has cost." Without hesitation, Odin plucked out his own eye and dropped it into the waters. In return he drank, and what he saw in the depths was not comfort but burden, the weaving of fate, the coming of Ragnarok, the doom that even gods could not escape. Yet he bore it, for knowledge to Odin was worth more than sight. Still his hunger grew. He sought the runes, those deep symbols of power that shaped magic and fate itself. For 9 nights he hung upon the wind-swept branches of Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, with no Viking food to strengthen him, no horn of mead to soothe his lips. Alone, suspended between life and death, he gave himself as sacrifice to himself. On the 9th night, the runes revealed themselves, glowing like fire in the dark. With them, Odin gained mastery over words, spells, and binding oaths, and he shared them with men so that Viking warriors could carve them on their blades, and Viking farmers on their ploughs, trusting that carved signs carried the will of the gods. Beside him always flew his ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. Each dawn they swept over the realms, whispering to Odin all they saw and heard. Yet, even with them, he feared their loss. "Each day I dread," he once confessed, "that memory may not return, for even a god of wisdom knows that thought without memory is empty, and memory without thought is grief." Odin's wisdom was never gentle, never soft. He did not merely ask questions, he wrested answers from blood and bone. He whispered charms to stir the dead, summoned prophecy from the lips of witches, and bent his ear to the breath of the slain on battlefields. To some, he was a guide, granting insight, poetry, and victory. To others, he was terrifying, a god who kept no boundary between sacrifice and slaughter, between gift and curse. And yet, it was this relentless seeking that made Odin the Seeker, the one-eyed wanderer, the spear god, the poet's muse, the weaver of fates. To the Viking child, he was proof that wisdom demands sacrifice. To the Viking man, he was warning that power gained through knowledge carries its own doom. Odin did not stop searching, for in every secret uncovered, he heard the whisper of another just beyond reach, and in chasing it, he bound all 9 realms into his restless grasp. In the high halls of Asgard, where golden beams caught the smoke of hearth fires, there dwelled Frigg, queen of the gods, wife to Odin, and mother of sons whose names shaped the destiny of worlds. To Viking men, she was the guardian of hearth and kin. To Viking women, she was the embodiment of dignity and hidden strength. And to Viking children, she was the silent watcher, whose prayers reached farther than their voices could. But behind her calm gaze lay power few could grasp. For Frigg and the weave of fate was more than a title, it was her truth. Frigg's gift was sight, sharper than the edge of any sword. She knew the paths that lay before both gods and mortals, the threads that tangled and snapped, the joys and griefs that were written long before a child's first cry. Yet what marked her was not only knowing, but choosing silence. For even when she saw the shadows that would one day fall upon her sons, she spoke little. Knowledge is weight, and in her stillness she bore the burden of the loom of fate, knowing that words once spoken can bind as surely as chains. Her halls, Fensalir, were filled with women who spun clouds and dew, who whispered secrets with their threads, for weaving was more than craft, it was prophecy. Each thread was a life, each knot a turning point, each cut an ending. Frigg's fingers never rested, and in her weaving she bound order into the chaos of the 9 realms. Yet to those who watched her, it seemed as though she did nothing more than tend to the quiet duties of queen and mother. But like the Viking woman who mends sails while her husband rows into battle, it is the unseen labour that holds kingdoms together. Her most cherished son was Balder, bright as the dawn, gentle as spring, loved by gods and men alike. Frigg foresaw his doom, and her heart trembled. She rode the realms, demanding oaths from stone and steel, beast and tree, fire and water, that none should harm him. Yet one thing she overlooked: the slender mistletoe, too young, too small to seem a threat. It was her silence, her one omission, that left the door ajar for fate to step through. And when Balder fell, pierced by a dart of mistletoe, all Asgard shook with grief, and the weave of fate revealed its merciless strength. Frigg wept, yet even her tears carried the wisdom of silence, for she knew no word could unmake what was written. Still, she was no passive shadow. She was called upon in childbirth, invoked in marriage, and honoured in the weaving of cloth and destiny alike. To Viking food shared at a wedding feast, her blessing was sought. In the cry of a newborn Viking child, her name was whispered for protection. She embodied both softness and steel, the hearth fire that warms and the loom thread that binds. And though Odin held the spear and throne, even he feared her silence, for silence held the truths he could not wrest even with sacrifice. Frigg's power was not thunder, nor storm, nor blade. It was the patience to know, the wisdom to endure, and the strength to remain silent even when the world begged for answers. In her, the Viking saw that power is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet hand upon the thread, guiding, waiting, holding firm. And when the weave of fate drew tight around the gods, Frigg stood as both mother and queen, her silence a shield, her sorrow a crown, her knowledge a weight none else could carry. Thor, hammer of the north, was no soft tale told to lull Viking children to sleep. It was thunder in the sky, the roar of storms at sea, the crash of hammer upon skull. Among all the gods, none stood closer to Viking men than Thor, for he was their shield against the chaos of giants, their defender when Midgard trembled, their companion in toil, feast and battle. Where Odin sought wisdom in silence, Thor brought order with the swing of Mjolnir, a hammer forged in fire and bound with runes, small in the hand yet heavy enough to shatter mountains. Thor's presence was like a storm made flesh. Red-bearded, broad as an oak, eyes flashing like lightning, he was strength without guile, fury without deceit. His power was simple and absolute, to protect. For the giants of Jotunheim hated Midgard, and their raids were constant, their malice endless. But so long as Thor's goats drew his chariot across the heavens, and so long as the sound of thunder rolled, men knew he was near. Every Viking child, hearing thunder shake the rafters, was told, "That is Thor's hammer striking. Fear not, he fights for us." Mjolnir was more than a weapon. It was a holy mark. With it, Thor slew the endless giants who threatened gods and men. With it, he blessed Viking food and ale at feasts, sanctified marriages, and hallowed the ground for oaths and graves. It was both weapon and sacred symbol, the iron bond between gods and mortals. When raised, it was thunder. When lowered, it was peace. None could mistake its sound, For when Mjolnir struck, the very sky shook with his will. Yet Thor was no distant war god seated on high thrones. He was kin to men, eating at their tables, drinking their ale, and laughing loud as firelight danced. He was rough, often mocked for his bluntness, but loved all the more for it. He cared little for riddles or schemes, but much for loyalty, for strength, and for the honour of kin. A Viking man who lifted his axe in defence of hearth and hall walked in Thor's shadow, and the Viking woman stirring pots of broth could whisper his name when blessing her children against cold and famine. The tales tell that Thor's goats, Tangrisnir and Tangnjosta, drew his chariot, hooves sparking fire upon stone, as he crossed the heavens. Yet even they were not spared his might, for when hunger gnawed, Thor slew them, cooked their flesh, and ate. By dawn he raised his hammer, and the beasts leapt whole again, their bones restored. It was a reminder to Viking men that from sacrifice comes renewal, and that nothing in Thor's keeping was lost forever. Many giants fell beneath Mjolnir's blows, but Thor's battles were not born of cruelty, they were the defence of order. For each giant that fell was another storm turned back, another harvest saved, another hall left standing. To strike them was to hold chaos at bay. To slay them was to remind the 9 realms that there was still law, still balance, still one who would not yield. Even gods respected him, for in Thor's strength there was no cunning, no trickery, only truth hammered hard into the bones of his foes. Yet even Thor, mighty as he was, bore the weight of fate. He knew that one day, at Ragnarok, he would face the Midgard serpent, Jormungandr, a beast so vast it circled the world. He knew their battle would shake the seas, that he would strike the serpent dead but fall after 9 paces, poisoned by its breath. Still, he did not flinch. For what is a Viking god, if not a reminder that even doom must be met with courage, even death with a hammer's swing? Thor, Hammer of the North, was protector, destroyer, sanctifier. To Viking men, he was the storm that shielded their hearth. To Viking women, he was the strength that guarded their children. To Viking children, he was the thunder that promised safety in the dark. He was not subtle nor gentle, but he was theirs, the hammer that rang across the north, the god whose might kept the world from falling into chaos. Loki the beautiful lie was fire wrapped in flesh, the sly grin behind every oath, the shifting shadow in every hall. To the gods of Asgard, he was both ally and curse, the companion who shared their feasts and the traitor who twisted their victories into ruin. To Viking men, his name was whispered with unease, for none could deny his wit, yet none could trust his hand. Where Odin sacrificed for wisdom and Thor thundered with strength, Loki slipped between words like a serpent, weaving mischief that began in laughter but ended in blood. He was fair of face, clever of tongue, and as restless as the wind. His beauty was dangerous, for it masked the poison beneath. He could shift his shape at will, hawk, mare, fly, fish, whatever guise would carry his schemes forward. To a Viking child hearing the old tales, Loki was a marvel, the trickster who outwitted giants, who bound chaos long enough for the gods to breathe. But to the Viking man, hardened by battle and wary of deceit, Loki was a warning. The smile at the feast may yet be the dagger at your back. There were times when his cunning saved the gods. When the builders of Asgard's walls demanded payment of Freya, sun, and moon, it was Loki who tricked the stallion Svadilfari and broke the giant's bargain. When Thor's hammer was stolen by frost giants, it was Loki, dressed as a maiden, who schemed the plan that brought Mjolnir back into the god's grip. In such moments, laughter filled the halls, and even Odin's one eye gleamed with reluctant approval. For Loki, mischief often carried salvation in its wake, but mischief is a river that deepens with each flood, and Loki could not dam his hunger for chaos. The same tongue that spoke clever counsel dripped venom in the ears of the gods. He mocked them in drunken feasts, unmasking shames with cruel delight. He stirred rivalries, whispered doubts, and and sowed seeds of discord that no spear could pierce. His words were weapons sharper than any Viking sword, his lies more enduring than iron chains. The darkest shadow he cast was over Balder, the beloved son of Odin and Frigg. When all things in the world had sworn never to harm him, Loki sought the one weakness left unbound. Mistletoe small, harmless, overlooked. From it he shaped a dart, placed it in the blind hand of Balder's brother Hother, and guided the throw. The dart struck true, and Balder fell, bright as dawn, struck down at noon. Asgard wailed in grief, and the laughter that once followed Loki's tricks turned to hatred. From that day, Loki's fate was sealed. The gods chased him, bound him with the entrails of his own son, and placed a serpent above his head to drip venom upon his face. His wife, Sigyn, knelt beside him, catching the poison in a bowl, but when the bowl overflowed, and she turned to empty it, the venom struck, and Loki writhed in agony, shaking the earth with his screams. To Viking ears, thunder was Thor, but the tremor of the ground was Loki's torment, echoing his doom. Yet, even bound, Loki's shadow lingered, for it was foretold that at Ragnarök he would break free, leading the giants and the dead against the gods he once feasted beside. Mischief would ripen into catastrophe, and the beautiful lie would reveal its final truth, that ruin often wears a smiling face. Loki was not strength, nor wisdom, nor fertility. He was the spark that set fire to the hall, the jest that turned to curse, the friend who betrayed. To Viking men and Viking women alike, his tale was both fascination and warning. For laughter is sweet, but when it comes from Loki's lips, it may yet carry the taste of ash. Freya, gold, tears, and seether, her name was spoken in whispers and in longing, in the hush of temples and the cries of battle. To Viking men, she was the promise of beauty and wealth, yet also the terror of death's choosing. To Viking women, she was power unbound, the mistress of fate, the keeper of secrets older than Asgard itself. She was not a gentle goddess, though her face shone like dawn, and her tears fell as gold. Freya was desire and war, magic and mourning, the heart of the Vanir whose power even the Aesir could not deny. Freya's beauty was legend, bright as the sun's fire, yet her adornments told a deeper tale. Around her neck gleamed Brisingamen, the necklace of the dwarves, wrought with such cunning that its glow rivaled the stars. To win it, Freya paid not with silver nor Viking food, but with her own body, lying with each dwarf in turn until the treasure was hers. Shame, some said. Power, others whispered. Yet none could deny Brisingamen's strength, a talisman of desire, authority, and enchantment that marked her as more than goddess, marked her as sovereign of her own will. But Freya was not only love and beauty, she was also Valkyrie queen, chooser of the slain. Half of those who fell in battle did not ride to Odin's Valhalla, but to her field, Folkvanga, where her hall Sessrumnir rose wide and welcoming. To Viking warriors who died with axe in hand, there was no shame in her choosing. To be taken by Freya was as great an honour as the All, Father's Hall, and many a Viking man prayed not to Odin, but to her, that his soul might feast beneath her roof. She wept often, for her husband Other wandered far, lost to her for long years, and each tear that fell from her eyes turned to drops of gold. Wealth itself flowed from her sorrow, and mortals gathered such tears as treasure. Yet behind that grief was fire, for Freya was mistress of Seithr, the deepest and darkest of magics. She taught even Odin this craft, weaving spells that bent the will of men, calling forth visions, unravelling minds, and shaping fate itself. In Viking halls, women who whispered charms at the loom, or stirred potions in smoke-filled rooms, were said to walk in Freyja's shadow, feared and honoured alike. Her strength was never bound by one form. She rode a chariot pulled by great cats, beasts wild and proud as she. She soared as a falcon through the skies when cloaked in her feathered mantle, swift as storm wind, free of tether. She stood in the shield clash of war, guiding the Valkyries, her hair bright against the dark field, her gaze choosing which Viking man would fall, which would rise again in eternal feasts. Yet for all her gifts, Freya was desired, hunted, bargained for. Giants lusted after her, kings sought her, and even the Aesir quarrelled over her favour. Once, Thor's hammer was stolen, and the thief demanded Freya as bride in return. She laughed in scorn, her wrath like frost upon the sea. For though she was courted, she belonged to none but herself, her will sharp as the edge of any sword. Freya, gold, tears, and seither, was not a tale of softness, but of power, raw and unashamed. She embodied beauty that burned, grief that gilded, and magic that bound. To Viking women, she was proof that strength did not always roar from spears, but from will, cunning, and desire. To Viking children, her story was a reminder that even gods weep, and those tears shape the world. To Viking men, she was both fear and longing, the goddess who might claim them in death or in dream. She was love and war entwined, the enchantress of the north, and her name endures as fiercely as her fire. Freya and the green god's bargain was a tale every Viking man and woman knew, though it was told with both awe and sorrow. For Freya, son of Njord and brother of Freya, was not only a god of harvest and peace, but of costly choices, where desire and sacrifice entwined. To Viking farmers, he was the giver of fertile fields, the one who sent rains and sun in balance so grain might swell and Viking food fill the hearth. To Viking children, he was the promise of summer's green wealth, the laughter of meadows, the gleam of golden barley swaying beneath the sky. Yet, behind his smile and open hand, lay a bargain that would echo at the world's end. Freya's gifts were many. He owned Skidbladnir, the ship wrought by dwarves, vast enough to carry all the gods, yet able to fold and slip into a pouch when not needed. Always it caught the best winds, carrying its master swift as thought across sea and sky. He also held Gullimbursti, the golden-bored steed, forged with bristles of shining metal that lit the night as it ran. These treasures spoke of his wealth, of a god whose rule was plenty. But the greatest treasure Freya once bore was a sword no common blade, but one that fought of its own will, flashing with fire, bringing victory without fail. With it, he was invincible, a king among gods. Yet, Freya's heart strayed beyond wisdom. From Odin's high seat, Hlidskjalf, he looked out and saw the giant maiden Gertha walking in her father's halls of frost and stone. Her beauty pierced him like no weapon could. He sickened with longing, pale as winter's sky, unable to eat or drink. His heart ached for her alone. His servant Skirnir, pitying his lord, agreed to woo Gertha, but the price was steep. Skirnir demanded Freya's sword, the very weapon that guarded him from doom. In his hunger for Gertha, Freya yielded, and thus was the bargain struck. Skirnir rode to Jotunheim, bearing gifts and threats. Gertha resisted at first, proud and cold as the stone halls she ruled. Yet, at last she consented, promising to meet Freya in the groves of Barri after 9 nights. Joy flooded the green god, and when she came, the earth itself trembled with renewal, her touch like spring breaking winter's hold. Fields flourished, forests swelled, and Viking farmers saw in that union the reason why crops rise each year from frozen soil. But though love gave life, the bargain had its price. Without his sword, Freya stood bare before fate. It was foretold that when Ragnarok came, he would face the fire giant Surtur, whose flames would sweep across the worlds. Empty-handed, Freya would fall, struck down by fire, his strength undone by his own sacrifice. His death would mark the breaking of peace, the triumph of ruin, and all for the love of a woman whose beauty he could not forsake. To Viking men, the tale was a warning. Desire can strip even gods of their might. To Viking women, it was truth. that union brings both joy and sorrow, life and loss, as sure as the changing of seasons. To Viking children, it was the mystery of the world that spring blooms because Freyr once gave away his blade for love, and winter comes because bargains demand their due. Freyr and the green god's bargain is more than myth. It is the breath of the earth itself. He was the giver of peace, the golden god of harvest, yet his doom was sealed in passion's fire. He brought life to soil, fattened herds, and filled the bowls of Viking food, but when the world burned, he would have no sword to lift. Such is the price of desire, that even a god may give all for love and lose the strength to save himself. Njörður and Skarði. Sea and Snow was no gentle love song, but a tale of two powers, bound by oaths rather than harmony, of land and sea, forced together though they belonged to different worlds. For Njörð, lord of the coast, was the Vanir god of wealth, of calm waters, of ships that carried Viking men across trade routes thick with silver and furs. His breath was the salt wind, his gift the bounty of fish, his favour sought by every Viking child who looked to the horizon with hunger in his belly. Skarði was his opposite, the daughter of a slain giant, raised among ice, rock, and the echo of wolves across the fjell. She was huntress, skier, mistress of bow and snow, her heart as cold and sharp as the mountains she claimed. Their union came not from love, but from vengeance. When her father, the giant Thjazi, was slain by the gods, Skarði stormed into Asgard, demanding blood price. She came armed, fierce, unyielding, but the gods, wary of endless feud, offered her recompense instead. Choose a husband from among them, but only by his feet. Skarði agreed, believing she would claim Balder, the fairest and most beloved. Yet when the veil lifted, the feet she had chosen were Njörður's broad and salt-worn, the feet of a seafarer, not the golden sun she desired. So it was that sea and snow were bound together, not by passion, but by bargain. At first, they sought peace in one another's halls. Njörður brought Skarði to Noatun, his dwelling by the shore, where seabirds cried and waves lapped endlessly against the stones. He loved it, the song of water, the wealth of trade, the smell of salt and tar. But Skarði heard only racket the screams of gulls, the crash of surf, the endless restless noise. To her ears it was torment. Then she brought Njörður to Thrymheim, her mountain home, where snow fell heavy and silence ruled. She thrived there, skiing across white slopes, hunting deer, her bow singing in the stillness. But Njörður froze in misery, lonely without his sea, cursed by the wolves howling through the night. They tried to share their lives, 9 nights in Noatun, 9 nights in Thrymheim, but neither place could ever be home to both. The sea god longed for open waters, the huntress for high peaks. At last they parted, not in hatred, but in truth they could not be joined, not as man and woman, not as sea and snow. To Viking men, this tale carried more than sorrow, it mirrored their land itself, for the north was both coast and mountain, fertile shore and frozen heights. A Viking man who fished the sea might trade with another who hunted reindeer upon the snowy fjells. Their worlds met in markets, not marriages, yet both were needed for survival. Njörður and Skarði spoke of that balance, the truth that the north was never one thing, but many, and that wealth was born not from unity, but from exchange. And yet the marriage left its mark. Skarði, though parted from Njörður, was welcomed among the gods, a huntress goddess, striding where few dared. Her bow was feared, her skis carried her faster than any horse, and Viking women invoked her when they hunted or sought justice for wrongs. Njörður remained lord of ships and coasts, the one Viking sailors prayed to when storms rose, offering sacrifice so their keels would cut safely through dark waters. Sea and snow, coast and mountain, man and woman they did not blend, but they endured side by side, each holding power the other could not claim. Njörður and Skarði, sea and snow is not a tale of failure, but but of truth. Even gods cannot bind what was never meant to be. Yet from their brief union came understanding that the Viking world was as much the roar of waves as the silence of the peaks, as much the salted fish that fed Viking food stores as the reindeer hides that clothed Viking children. Together, though apart, they remain the eternal face of the North. Tyr's hand and the law was a tale told not with laughter, but with solemn nods by the fire, for it carried the weight of justice and the blood price it demands. Among the gods of Asgard, Tyr was no trickster, no dreamer of schemes, nor stormbringer like Thor. He was the god of law, of oaths, of the binding word that held chaos at bay. To Viking men, his name was spoken when swearing treaties, when settling disputes, when blade and coin alike needed the balance of fairness. Yet his tale reminds us that even justice bleeds, and sometimes it bleeds from the hand of the one who swears to uphold it. The wolf Fenrir was born of Loki's brood, monstrous child of deceit and giantess. From the start, his size grew beyond reason, his hunger without end, his eyes burning with cunning. The gods feared him, for prophecy whispered that in the last days he would break loose, devour Odin himself, and bring ruin upon the worlds. Yet as he grew, none dared strike him down, for killing a beast so bound to fate might tear the threads of the Norns too soon. Instead, they sought to bind him. The first chains were of iron, heavy as mountain roots, but Fenrir shattered them as if snapping straw. The second was stronger still, forged with skill and weight. Yet again the wolf shook himself free, his laughter like thunder rolling across Jotunheim. The gods trembled, for each chain broken only proved his strength. So they turned to the dwarves, master forgers beneath the earth, who crafted Gleipnir, a fetter unlike any made before. It was smooth as silk, supple as ribbon, yet woven with impossibilities. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, the sinews of a bear, and the spittle of a bird. All things unseen, yet real, gathered into a rope stronger than steel. But Fenrir, wise in suspicion, saw the gods bring this soft binding, and knew deceit hid within it. He agreed to test it, but only if one god would place a hand in his jaws as pledge of good faith. Silence fell upon Asgard. None dared, none but Tyr. For Tyr was oath itself, the god who stood for truth, the one Viking men invoked when pledging their honour over meat, mead, or blood. He met Fenrir's gaze and did not flinch. Slowly, he set his right hand between the wolf's teeth. The gods bound Fenrir with Gleipnir, and though the wolf strained, though he writhed and roared, the silken rope held. The mountains shook, the earth split, but the fetter did not break. Betrayed, Fenrir snapped his jaws, and Tyr's hand was torn away, blood falling on the stones of Asgard. Yet Tyr did not cry out. He stood silent, one hand gone, but justice done. The gods rejoiced that the beast was bound, but none looked Tyr in the eye, for his loss was the price of their safety, his wound the mark of their deceit. To Viking men, this tale cut deep. Tyr's hand was the sacrifice that proved oaths are more than words. They demand flesh, demand pain, demand the strength to stand even when it costs dearly. A Viking child hearing this story learned that justice is no feast, no bright game, but a burden carried with scars. A Viking woman blessing her sons before battle might whisper Tyr's name, reminding them that honour is not kept by chance, but by choice, even when it maims. Tyr's hand and the law is not a tale of triumph, but of truth. It teaches that justice is never free, that binding chaos requires loss, and that honour often asks more than a man is willing to give. The wolf waits still, bound in silence, and Tyr waits too, one-handed, the blood of his oath forever sealing the cost of law. Heimdall at the Rainbow Bridge was the sentinel no storm could surprise, no shadow could slip past, for his gaze stretched farther than the eagle's flight, and his ears caught whispers carried on the gentlest wind. He was the watcher of Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that arched between Asgard and Midgard, a shining span, fragile yet fierce, the road of gods and the path of doom. To Viking men, he was the unseen guard who kept the worlds apart, the one who watched while others feasted, whose duty never slept. Born of 9 mothers, the daughters of the sea, Heimdall carried the mystery of the deep and the brightness of the sky. His skin gleamed with light, his presence pure as the morning sun, and yet he was not a god of harvest or war. He was the threshold, the space between. He stood where paths converged, where enemies might come, where fate might strike. The rainbow bridge beneath his feet shimmered with fire, so strong that no frost giant could cross it unchallenged. Still, Heimdall's vigilance was the true defence, for none could deceive him. It is said his sight reached to the farthest shore, that he could see a Viking child stirring in the cradle, that he could hear wool grow upon a sheep's back, even the grass pushing through soil. To the people of the north, who bent their heads to hear the first Thor drip from the eaves or the silence before a storm, such powers were no fancy. They were truths wrapped in the life they knew. Nothing escaped Heimdall, not the whisper of a foe, nor the soft sigh of fate. Day and night he stood guard. While Odin wandered for wisdom and Thor hunted giants with hammer in hand, Heimdall's watch never faltered. He bore Gjallarhorn, the great horn whose blast would shake all the 9 realms. It lay beside him, silent as long as he lived, waiting for the one moment when its sound would summon gods and men alike to the last battle. To Viking men gathered round fires, the thought of that horn was both dread and comfort. Dread of Ragnarok, comfort that no doom would come unseen. Yet Heimdall was more than a sentinel of stone and silence. He was also the one who taught order, who gave men the ways of rank and kinship. In ancient song it is told that he walked among Viking folk as Rig, visiting halls of thralls, farmers and chieftains, blessing each with the customs that shaped their lives. Through him, men learned where they belonged, one to serve, one to toil, one to rule. Thus, the structure of Viking life was bound to the watchman himself, as though the same eye that guarded Asgard also measured the worth of men. Still, it was his post at Bifrost that made his name eternal. No feast could distract him, no ale dull his mind. He was the iron will at the bridge, the lone figure who faced the dark and did not look away. Prophecy said he would meet Loki in the final hour, 2 enemies bound as mirrors of cunning and vigilance, and their clash would be the end of them both. Yet even knowing his doom, Heimdall did not waver. For the Watcher's duty is not glory, nor reward, but endurance. To Viking men and Viking women alike, Heimdall was proof that strength is not only in swinging the sword, but in standing unyielding, night after night, while others sleep. To Viking children, his tale was the reminder that someone always keeps the fire lit, always listens, always guards the path. Heimdall at the Rainbow Bridge was more than a god. He was the wall of the world, the ear that hears fate approach, the eye that sees the end, and the horn whose voice will call the last dawn. Balder the Bright was the joy of Asgard, the light that softened the shadows of gods and men. His beauty was a flame without heat, a glow that warmed the heart rather than scorched the eye. Wherever Balder walked, the air seemed sweeter, the fields greener, and Viking children laughed more freely. He was beloved beyond all others, not for power or cunning, but for purity. Yet light draws envy, as flame draws moth, and Balder's brightness, though cherished, cast a shadow of doom foretold in dream. One night, Balder's sleep was broken by visions of his own death. He saw darkness smother his glow, saw weeping spread through Asgard like winter, saw the 9 realms tilt toward ruin. He woke trembling, and the gods, hearing of his dreams, grew heavy with dread. For in Norse hearts, dreams were not passing fancies, but whispers of the Norns, threads already spun upon the loom of fate. Frigg, his mother, whose love ran deeper than the roots of Yggdrasil, could not bear the thought. She swore to shield her son. Across the worlds she went, weaving a great vow, that fire would not burn him, that water would not drown him, that iron would not wound him, nor stone break him, nor beasts bite him, nor sickness touch him. All living things and all that lived in them promised never to harm Balder. The gods rejoiced, for fate seemed undone, and their fear turned to laughter. In Asgard's meadows they tested him. A Viking man hurled his spear, and it glanced away. A Viking child flung stones, and they bounced harmless from his skin. Arrows snapped, blades broke, even Thor's mighty strength could not bruise him. The Aesir laughed as they struck, each blow a game, a celebration of the god untouchable. Balder shone in their midst, smiling, unharmed. But one thing Frigg overlooked. In her wide gathering of oaths, she passed by the mistletoe, small, pale, and thought too young, too weak, too harmless to ask for promise. Loki, ever the prowler of weakness, learned of this. His heart, twisted by spite and cunning, could not endure the sight of joy unmarred. Disguised as an old woman, he drew the secret from Frigg's lips, and from the mistletoe he shaped a dart, slender, sharp, deadly, in silence. That day in Asgard, while the gods laughed at their game of hurling, one stood apart, Huther, Balder's blind brother, who had no aim and so took no part. Loki came to him, whispering poison sweet, placing the dart in his hand, guiding his arm. Why should you not honour your brother as the others do? I will help you. Trusting, blind Hother loosed the shaft. It flew true, struck Balder, and pierced his heart. The laughter ended in horror. The Bright One fell. Silence crushed Asgard. The gods gathered, yet none could lift him, none could undo the wound. Balder lay pale, his glow fading like embers drowned in ash. Frigg wept, her cries shaking the heavens, her tears flowing like rivers, and even Viking men, hardened by steel and sea, told how the world dimmed that day. Odin's heart broke, for he knew this death was not only sorrow, but the first great stone set rolling toward Ragnarök. They sent Balder to Hel's realm, but not without hope. Hermother, brave and swift, rode Sleipnir down the shadowed path, begging Hel to release him. She agreed only if all things wept for Balder. And so they did, men and women, gods and giants, beasts and earth itself. Viking children cried, Viking food rotted on the hearth, even stone was said to weep dew. Yet one being refused, Thuk, said to be Loki, in disguise her dry eyes, sealing Balder's fate. Thus the Bright One remained in Hel's cold hall, his absence a wound that could not close. His death marked the tilt of the cosmos, for without Balder the balance broke, and doom crept nearer. To Viking men, Balder's fall was a tale of beauty betrayed, of laughter turned to silence, of light snuffed by envy and fate. Balder the Bright, once shielded from harm, became proof that no oath, no love, no spell could turn aside what the Norns had written. And from that moment, the gods themselves knew the end was coming. Idun's apples were the hidden heart of Asgard, the quiet treasure without which the gods themselves would wither like autumn leaves. Idun, fair and gentle, keeper of the orchard, bore a simple but eternal duty. She guarded the golden apples of youth. With them, the Aesir remained strong, unbent, unbroken, their faces fair, their might unyielding. Without them, even Odin's one-eyed wisdom would dim, even Thor's thunder would falter, even the laughter of Viking children in the halls of men would echo a little less bright. For what are gods if not youth eternal, standing between men and the shadows of time? Idun walked softly through her grove, her hands cradling the shining fruit, each apple shimmering as though the dawn had been poured into its skin. She gave them not freely, but at need, each bite a renewal, each taste a stave against decay. The gods trusted her above all to keep them, for no warrior can fight if his limbs grow weary, no queen can rule if her beauty fades, and no god can inspire Viking men if his back stoops with age. Her task seemed simple, but in it rested the very strength of Asgard. Yet envy watches all treasures, and mischief prowls even the halls of the gods. Loki, ever the weaver of lies, found himself tangled in one of his own. Captured by the giant Thjazi in eagle shape, he was dragged across stone and sky until his bones ached and his pride cracked. Thjazi released him only on a bargain: bring Idun and her apples beyond Asgard's gates. Loki agreed, as he always did when his skin was on the line, and so doom crept into the orchard. With silver tongue and serpent smile, Loki lured Idun from her grove. He whispered of apples finer still, just beyond the walls, waiting for her hand. Trusting, innocent, she followed, carrying her basket of gold. But when she stepped into the wild, Thjazi swooped down, talons like knives, wings blotting out the Sunday. He seized Idun and bore her away to his mountain stronghold, her cries fading into the wind. The apples went with her, and Asgard was left bare. At first, the gods did not notice, but days passed, then weeks, and the bloom began to fade. Wrinkles crept upon fair faces, hair silvered, Odin's shoulders bent beneath the weight of years. Thor's strength waned, even his hammer felt heavy. The Vanir grew frail, Freya's tears lost their gleam, and laughter turned to silence. Viking men told of omens in the sky, for the gods themselves looked old, and the 9 realms shuddered with unease. In council, suspicion flared. Who had betrayed them? Eyes turned to Loki, for guilt clung to him like smoke to fire. Under wrath and threat he confessed, though not without excuses. Odin's gaze burned, Thor's fists clenched, and the gods demanded he mend the harm. With no escape, Loki changed shape, feathers sprouting as he took falcon form, and sped across the skies to Thjazi's hall. There, Idun sat imprisoned, her apples beside her, the glow of Asgard dimmed by cold stone walls. Loki, quick and cunning, transformed her into a nut, tucked her into his claws, and fled. But Thjazi, sensing the theft, gave chase, his eagle wings tearing the heavens, the sky thundered with their flight, the wind screaming around them. Ahead, Asgard's walls rose, the gods watching in terror. They lit great fires at the gates, flames roaring high. Loki darted through, dropping Idun safely within, while Thjazi, blinded by rage, plunged into the fire and fell in ashes. With Idun restored, the apples returned to the hands of the gods. They bit deep, and age melted like frost. Before the Sunday strength filled them, youth renewed, laughter returned to the golden halls. But they never forgot the fear of that hunger, the shadow of age creeping near. Idun's apples were not only fruit, nor simple gift. They were the promise that youth itself must be guarded, for without it even gods grow frail. To Viking men, it was a lesson etched in saga. Treasure is never safe, and even eternity needs a watchful hand. And so long as Idun walked her orchard, the gods would stand radiant, fierce, and forever young. Sif, hair of gold, was more than a goddess with shining locks. She was the living symbol of harvest, beauty, and the wealth that lay in fertile earth. To Viking men, who swung their scythes through barley fields, her name was whispered as the grain bent golden under the summer Sunday. To Viking women, who baked bread from that harvest, she was the promise that the hearth would never go cold. Her hair, cascading like rivers of sunlight, was not simply adornment. It was the very image of life's bounty, the beauty that fed warriors and cradled Viking children in seasons of plenty. But symbols are fragile, and envy prowls even the brightest halls. One night, while the gods slept and Asgard's torches burned low, Loki crept into Sif's chamber. Mischief stirred in him like a serpent, not driven by hunger for power, but by that twisted joy he found in breaking what others loved. With sly fingers, he cut away Sif's golden hair, severing more than beauty. When she woke, the hall echoed with her cries, her head bare, her pride stripped. The gods came running, and shame cloaked the air like smoke. Thor's wrath was thunder itself. His wife's beauty, his people's symbol of harvest, had been defiled. He seized Loki by the throat, his grip like iron, demanding reparation. Loki, gasping, swore he would make it right, swore he would find hair finer still, hair that grew like the fields themselves. Released, he fled not to Midgard or Jotunheim, but to the smoky forges beneath the earth, where dwarves, the black-handed smiths, hammered wonders out of fire and ore. There, Loki struck his bargain. The sons of Ivaldi, master craftsmen, forged treasures to mend his folly. They shaped a new crown of hair for Sif, spun not from common gold, but from threads alive with magic. When placed upon her head, it rooted into her scalp, and grew as true hair, each strand shining with the brilliance of ripe harvest. No mortal maiden could match it, no hall could dim it, no season could rob it of glow. Through Loki's treachery and the dwarf's skill, Sif's beauty was restored greater than before. Yet the tale did not end with her hair alone, for the dwarves, eager to prove their craft, forged other wonders in that same contest. Odin's spear, Gungnir, whose thrust never missed. Freya's ship, Skithbladnir, which carried all armies and folded into a pouch, and most famed, Thor's hammer Mjolnir, the shield of Midgard, born of sparks and sweat. Thus, from Loki's crime came not only Sif's new hair, but the very weapons and treasures that girded the gods for ages. Still, Sif's golden crown held its place as more than ornament. To Viking farmers, it was the shining harvest, cut and stored before winter's bite. To Viking skalds, it was the golden field that fed the sword arm of a warrior. To Viking children, it was the glow of a mother's care, the promise of bread on the hearth. And to Thor, it was the pride of his hall, proof that even when mischief sought to mar the gods, beauty could be reborn stronger than before. Sif herself did not seek battle nor storm. She was no wielder of thunder, no seer of fates, yet her presence bound the hall of Asgard as surely as Thor's hammer struck down giants. She was harvest made flesh, her hair the light that whispered of plenty, her beauty the quiet strength that reminded warriors why they fought, why they returned from raid and sea to hearth and home. Sif, hair of gold, shows that in the Viking world, beauty was never shallow, nor symbols idle. A strand of hair could embody the turning of seasons, the lifeblood of fields, the pride of gods. And though Loki's knife once sought to strip it away, the golden locks returned, brighter than ever, binding gods and men alike to the truth that what is lost may yet be remade, and what is remade may shine all the stronger. In the deep caverns, where no sunlight ever dared to wander, the dwarfs shaped wonders that even the gods could not dream. Their forges burned with fire stolen from the heart of the earth, their hammers rang like thunder in stone, and from their hands came treasures that defined the fate of the 9 realms. To Viking men, who swung iron axes and patched cracked shields, the dwarfs were half myth, half truth, shadowed figures who turned raw stone into marvels, who made the tools that upheld gods and men alike. It was Loki, as ever, who set their craft into saga. Having shorn Sif's golden hair in malice, he was forced to mend his deed. Down into the earth he crept, to the sons of Ivaldi, smiths whose names carried the weight of legend. There bargains were struck, and flames were fed. From their anvils came gifts no mortal hand could fashion. For Sif they spun golden hair that rooted like living grain, shining brighter than any Viking field at harvest. For Odin they forged Gungnir, the spear that never faltered in flight, a weapon of pure will bound in steel. For Freya they wrought Skithbladnir, the ship that could hold every warrior of Midgard, yet fold small enough to slip into a pouch, its sails always catching fair winds. But Loki's hunger for mischief did not rest. He carried these treasures upward, then whispered that other smiths could do better. He sought out Brokkr and Sindri, 2 brothers who worked in darker smoke, their skill unmatched, their pride fierce. Loki wagered his head that they could not surpass the works of Ivaldi's kin. The brothers accepted, stoking their forge until sparks bled like stars. Sindri laid the iron, Brokkr worked the bellows, and Loki, fearing his wager, sought to ruin them. As the hammer fell, he turned to fly form, stinging, biting, gnawing. He bit Brokkr's hand until blood streamed, yet still the dwarf held steady, sweat pouring, the bellows never faltering. From the forge leapt wonders, Draupnir, Odin's ring, from which 8 new rings dripped every 9th night, a symbol of unending wealth. Gullimbursti, the golden boar, its bristles glowing so it could run faster than any steed, carrying Freya through night and mist. And greatest of all, Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, short-handled from Loki's meddling, yet mighty beyond measure, striking down giants, shattering mountains, returning to Thor's hand no matter the throw. The gods gathered, weighing the treasures. Odin held Gungnir, its balance flawless, its runes binding victory. Draupnir gleamed on his arm, wealth unending. Freya marvelled at his ship and his boar, both swift and sure. Sif's hair grew anew, waving like barley. Yet all eyes turned when Thor raised Mjolnir, lightning crackling at its edge. With this hammer, Asgard's walls were safe. Midgard's men protected, the frost giants checked. Even Loki could not deny it. The dwarfs had outdone themselves. But bargains have prices. Brokkr demanded Loki's head, as the wager had promised. The trickster wriggled free with words, claiming they had his head but not his neck, and so the dwarfs, cheated of their prize, stitched his lips shut with iron thread. Thus even the slyest tongue was silenced, if only for a while. The gods kept their treasures, each one a piece of destiny. Gungnir piercing through battles, Draupnir dripping wealth, Mjolnir roaring in the storm. And from that day, Viking men told of the dwarfs beneath the earth, masters of craft, makers of wonders, whose hands could shape not only tools, but the turning of ages. To Viking children listening by fire, the tale carried its lesson. Power is born not only in battle, but in skill. Treasures are not given, but forged in flame, in bargain, and in blood. Wolves, serpents, and the dead, these were not creatures born of chance, but the bloodline of Loki, the trickster whose laughter often carried ruin. By him and the giantess Angrboda came 3 children, each so dire that even the gods trembled to speak their names. Fenrir, the wolf destined to break chains and devour worlds. Jörmungandr, the serpent so vast it coiled the seas themselves. And Hel, the pale queen of the underworld, whose half-living face gazed on both life and death. They were Odin's grandchildren by blood, yet they bore no love for Asgard, only shadow, prophecy, and doom. Fenrir grew in Asgard at first, a pup brought into the gods' keeping. He was massive even as a youth, his jaws sharper than iron, his hunger endless. Viking children might wrestle pups in the yard, but no Viking man would dare approach this beast when he was barely grown. Only Tyr, god of law and oaths, fed him with a steady hand, for all others feared the glint in Fenrir's eyes. The Norns whispered that this wolf would one day break free and devour Odin himself. The gods, restless with fear, forged chains to bind him. The first, Ladding, Fenrir snapped like a twig. The second, Dromi, he tore apart as if it were straw. At last, the dwarfs crafted Gleipnir, a ribbon smooth as silk, yet strong with the strength of 6 impossibilities. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, the sinew of a bear, and the spittle of a bird. With cunning words they coaxed Fenrir to test it, but he sensed deceit. He agreed only if one god placed a hand within his jaws as pledge of honesty. Tyr stepped forward, brave and grim. When Fenrir found himself bound and betrayed, he bit down, severing Tyr's hand, blood spraying across the stones. From then on, the wolf strained against Gleipnir, his howls shaking the worlds, until Ragnarok would loose him. Jörmungandr, the second child, Odin hurled into the sea. There the serpent grew, vast beyond measure, his body circling Midgard, tail clamped in his fanged jaws. Viking sailors spoke of waves that rose higher than cliffs, of storms that roared without warning. These were Jörmungandr's stirrings beneath the water. Thor, ever the slayer of giants, despised him most. In one tale, he fished with Hymir, casting oxhead as bait, and hooked the Midgard serpent itself. The sea boiled as Thor hauled with all his might, the serpent rising, venom dripping, eyes glowing like storm fire. The hammer rose, ready to strike, but Hymir, terrified, cut the line. The serpent sank back, but not slain. Thor's battle with him waits for Ragnarok, where the two shall meet and kill one another, thunder against tide, poison against storm. And then Hel, their sister, the quietest yet perhaps most dreadful, Odin cast her down to rule over those who die not in battle but of age, of sickness, of slow wasting. Half her flesh was fair and living, half dark and rotted, a mirror of her realm. She sits in her hall, Eldjudnir, beneath roots of Yggdrasil, presiding over the dead who find no place in Valhalla or Folkvanga. Viking men feared her not as warriors, but as the end that awaits most mortals, the bed where no songs are sung. She is not cruel, nor merciful, but inevitable. To her hall go kings and thralls alike, and from her throne she hears no laughter. These three children, wolves, serpents, and the dead, were not mere beasts nor shadows. They were fate itself, given flesh. Odin looked upon them, and knew that in them lay the ruin of gods, yet none could be unmade. The wolf strained, the serpent slumbered, the queen sat in her half-lit hall. And in the tales told by Viking skalds, they stood not only as horrors, but as reminders. Even gods sire their doom, and even the mightiest halls cast long shadows. Valkyries and the Einherjar few names stirred a Viking heart more fiercely, for in them lay the promise that death was not an end but a passage to glory. When Viking men marched to battle with axe in hand and shield raised high, they knew eyes were upon them, not only the eyes of comrades or foes, but the shining gaze of Odin's maidens, the Valkyries, who soared unseen above the clash of steel. They were the choosers of the slain, fierce and beautiful, clad in mail that shimmered like dawn on frost. Their steeds thundered across the sky, hooves striking sparks that fell as earthly fire. To Viking warriors, a glimpse of a Valkyrie's pale hand reaching through the smoke of battle was both terror and triumph. For though she brought death, she also brought the promise of Valhalla, Odin's hall, where the honoured dead would rise again. Valhalla was no idle paradise. It was a vast hall of shields, its rafters braced with spears, its benches filled with heroes the Einherjar, chosen dead. There, Viking warriors feasted each night upon the meat of the ever-living boar, Saehrimnir, roasted anew each evening, and drank mead flowing from the udder of Heidrun, a goat who grazed upon Yggdrasil itself. But the feast was but half their joy. By day, the Einherjar clashed in endless battle upon the plain, hacking, hewing, and falling, only to rise again unbroken. It was training, a forging of spirit, for they prepared not for leisure, but for Ragnarok, when Odin would call them forth to fight beside the gods against the end of all things. To die well was the key. Not all Viking men entered Valhalla, no matter their courage. The Valkyries chose with purpose. A coward's death, a death in bed, or the wasting away of age, led not to Odin's hall but to Hel's cold embrace. But a man who fought with fury, who struck until the end, who showed no fear in the moment of his doom that man's spirit might be lifted by the Valkyrie's hands, borne on winds to the golden hall. To Viking children listening at hearthfires, this was no idle story. It shaped their lives. To die with honour was to ensure the clan's pride, and to join the gods in their last great struggle. The Valkyries themselves were more than mere heralds. Some were daughters of kings, bound in service to Odin. Others were spirits born of battle, shining as fire over bloodied fields. They could love, too, and in rare tales they wed mortal men. Yet their duty was always to Odin first, and to the weaving of fate. In their eyes burned the knowledge that each warrior's end was not chance, but choice. And they were the ones who carried that choice into action. Within Valhalla, the Einherjar were not idle shades, but a living army, sharpened daily by combat, bound by fellowship, and strengthened by feast. Their laughter shook the hall, their toasts rang like thunder, their songs spoke of both sorrow and triumph. They were Viking men raised to eternal purpose, proof that courage outlives the grave. And so, the Valkyries and the Einherjar became more than myth, they were a covenant. They taught that courage was the coin of eternity, that mead and song were the reward of valour, that fear was a chain heavier than iron. A Viking man might leave behind land, kin, and food, but if he left behind a tale of bravery, the Valkyries would come. Their wings would cut through smoke, their hands would lift him, and he would rise not as a fallen man, but as Einherjar, sworn to fight forever in Odin's hall, awaiting the day when the heavens themselves would shatter. The Norns and the measure of fate were feared even by the gods themselves. While Odin sat upon his high throne, while Thor raised Mjolnir against giants, while a Viking man sharpened his axe for battle, all of them knew that above strength and wisdom there stood three silent women at the roots of Yggdrasil. Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld the Norns wove the destiny of gods and men alike, binding each life as tightly as a ship's knot on stormy seas. Their dwelling was by the well of Urd, beneath the vast ash whose branches held the 9 realms. There, where the roots drank from the waters of time itself, the Norns carved runes and spun threads no hand could break. Urd, the past, gazed into the waters where all that had been shimmered like shadows. Verdandi, the present, drew each moment out of the well like drops of fresh water, fleeting yet vital. Skuld, the future, sat stern and silent, weaving what must come, her face unreadable as a night without moon. The gods themselves walked with caution before them. Even Odin, who had sacrificed an eye for wisdom, bent low when seeking counsel at the well. He had hurled himself upon Yggdrasil, and hung for 9 nights pierced by his own spear to seize the secret of runes, yet even those runes only whispered fragments of what the Norns held. They alone knew the full measure of the skein, and from their judgment no sword nor spell could shield. For Viking men, who steered their ships into seas without promise of return, the Norns were both terror and comfort. If death waited beyond the next wave, it was not cruelty, but fate. If a Viking child grew into a great chieftain while his brother withered unnamed, it was the Norns' measure that marked it so. Yet this did not mean surrender. To live as though every day were one's last, to carve honour in deed and word, this was to answer fate with defiance, not despair. For though the threads could not be broken, they could be coloured with glory. The Norns' runes were more than marks on wood or stone. They were whispers of the deep order, signs of forces older than gods, etched into the very bark of Yggdrasil. A Viking skald might cut them into his drinking horn, a Viking warrior might carve them into his spear shaft, hoping to bind luck or ward off ill fate. But such marks were only echoes, sparks cast from the great forge at the well. The true power lay with the Norns, whose carvings in the roots of the world shaped the rise and fall of empires. And yet, some tales suggest fate could bend, if only slightly. Odin's endless quest for foresight was a struggle against Skuld's silence. Loki's mischief often sought to twist what was foreseen. Even mortal men prayed, carved runes, or sought charms to delay death's hand. But always, the Norns' weaving endured. The wolf Fenrir would break free, Jormungandr would rise, Ragnarok would come. What bent was not fate itself, but the path by which it was reached, the choices that filled the spaces between certainty and doom. To Viking ears, gathered close to the hearth, the Norn's tale was no soft lullaby. It was a stern reminder. No man outruns the well, no woman escapes the thread, no god breaks the carving in the root. Yet it was also a call to courage, for if fate is certain, then cowardice gains nothing. If death is woven, then let it be faced with axe in hand and mead awaiting in Valhalla. So the Norns sat, 3 figures beneath the tree, pouring water over Yggdrasil's roots to keep it green, etching runes that echoed through all realms. Urd, Verdandi, Skuld, their whispers shaped kings and farmers alike. Viking, food and feasts, war cries and weddings, life and death. The gods feared them, men revered them, and all of creation bent beneath their measure, for in the end it was their hands that held the skein of every soul. Runes, Seidr, and Golder, these were the hidden powers that thrummed beneath Viking life, as real as the clash of iron or the taste of Viking food at the hearth. To the unwise they seemed like superstition, but to those who carved, chanted, or wove them, they were doors into the unseen, bridges between men, gods, and the threads of fate. Runes were more than letters. To a Viking child learning their shapes, they were the bones of speech, but to the skalds and wise men, they were carved secrets, born from Odin's agony upon Yggdrasil. Each rune carried not only sound, but force. To cut Fehu upon a sword was to invite wealth and fire. To carve Algiz on a shield was to call protection from spear and arrow. They were etched on ships to steady voyages, on drinking horns to guard against poison, on grave markers to anchor memory. Yet every cut of the knife was dangerous, for to misuse a rune was to summon what one could not command. The wood or stone bore the scar, but the world bore the consequence. If runes were carved power, Seidr was woven power. This magic belonged often to women, the vulva, the seeress who sat cloaked in furs, while Viking men trembled to hear her voice. She drifted into trance with chanting and staff, her spirit wandering through worlds. From her lips poured visions of harvest and hunger, of victory or death in battle. Kings bent their pride to hear her words, for even Odin himself practiced Seidr, though it was seen as unmanly, a breaking of warriors' honour. The practice blurred the lines of body and spirit, and those who wielded it paid a price. A Viking man who tried might earn whispers of shame, but when storms loomed or enemies gathered, even the proud sought Seidr's wisdom. Galder was yet another path, the power of sound itself. To sing was to shape. The skalds knew this well. Songs carried memory, raised courage, and bound men together. But Galder was more than music. It was chanting runes aloud, stretching sounds until they shook the marrow. A Viking warrior might bellow Galder before battle, his voice breaking fear from his bones. A healer might whisper Galder over wounds, lacing sound with will to knit flesh. These chants could soothe, terrify, or summon forces that lurked just beyond sight. And, like fire, their warmth could save or burn. Together, these crafts shaped how Vikings saw their place in the cosmos. They believed words had weight, that carved lines and chanted syllables carried more than air. To speak an oath was to bind one's soul. To break it was to court ruin, for the runes and the gods remembered. To weave Seidr was to step into the loom of fate, tugging at threads that were not one's own. To wield Galder was to wield the breath of creation itself. Yet all came with taboo. Too much Seidr, and a soul might not return whole. Too reckless with Galder, and spirits might answer unbidden. Too arrogant with runes, and the carving might turn on its maker. These were not games, but perils wrapped in mystery. Still, around Viking hearths, children traced runes in the dirt. Farmers whispered charms to guard their fields. Warriors scratched marks into axe blades before setting sail. And in the silence of long nights, voices rose in Galder, echoing into the dark, a reminder that the world was never only what eyes could see. For in the deep heart of Viking belief, the gods had left tools, sound, symbol, trance, and taboo, and men and women dared to use them, even knowing that magic often asked for more than it gave. Feasts, oaths, and blot. These were the heartbeats of Viking worship, the way gods and men met not in distant heavens, but in firelit gatherings beneath the open sky. A Viking man could raise his sword in battle or his oar upon the sea, but without these sacred rites, his bond to the divine would wither like grain in frost. Worship was not only prayer, it was feast, sacrifice, and vow, binding clan and cosmos in one circle of honour. At the turning of the seasons, when the snows broke or the harvest ripened, Viking folk gathered in sacred groves or great halls. The blot, the offering, was the bridge between man and God. Cattle, swine, or horses were led forth, their breaths steaming in the cold air, their hides brushed as if to honour them before the knife. The blood, warm and red, was caught in bowls, sprinkled upon stones, upon carved idols, upon the foreheads of those gathered. It was not cruelty, but covenant, the lifeblood of the herd, returned to the gods who gave it. A Viking child watched wide-eyed as the sacred act unfolded, learning that life was not theirs alone, but a gift repaid in kind. Yet the blot was only the beginning. When sacrifice was done, the feast began. Roasted meat filled the hall, the smell of fat and smoke mingling with pine torches. Horns of mead passed from hand to hand, each sip a link in a chain of fellowship. Here oaths were sworn, binding stronger than iron. A Viking warrior might rise, hand upon the horn, swearing vengeance for a fallen brother, or promising loyalty to his jarl. To break such a vow was unthinkable, for the gods themselves heard every word. Oaths spoken at the feast bound not only the speaker, but the honour of his entire kin. The gods were never far from such gatherings. Odin's wisdom was invoked in words of law, Thor's hammer raised to bless the meat, Freya called upon to grant fertile fields and fruitful wombs. Freya too was honoured, for she held sway over both love and battle. To call their names was to remind every Viking man and woman that the divine sat beside them in spirit, listening as they laughed, ate, and vowed. Sacred places mattered deeply. Some clans raised temples of wood and stone, richly adorned with gold, where idols of the gods stood draped in offerings. Others held to older ways, gathering in groves where the earth itself was altar, where great trees whispered with unseen presence. Stones set in circles, mounds where ancestors slept, rivers where sacrifices were cast. Each was touched by the unseen, each was a place where worlds brushed together. Blot was not only for gods, but for the dead. Ancestors were honoured with offerings, their names spoken so they lived again in memory. A Viking man knew he carried not only his own fate, but the weight of all who came before him. To pour mead upon the ground was to share drink with the departed, to keep kinship unbroken between this world and the next. These rites were not solemn in silence, but alive with song, laughter, and the clash of cups. To worship was to live fully, to bind joy and sacrifice together. The hall rang with boasts, tales of valour, and the pounding of fists upon tables. The gods demanded reverence, but they also demanded courage, fellowship, and the willingness to face life's trials as one people. So it was that feasts, oaths, and blot bound the Viking world. The smoke of sacrifice curled toward Asgard, the mead horn passed with sacred vows, and the songs of warriors rose into the night. In these acts the gods were not distant. They were present, seated among men, sharing in meat, in blood, and in promise. To feast was to worship, to swear was to bind the soul, and to sacrifice was to remind all that life and death alike belong to powers greater than man. Giants are people too, or so the old skalds reminded their listeners when they spoke of the Jotnar. To the Viking man seated by the hearth, the word giant conjured visions of towering foes with frost on their brows, wielding mountains as weapons. Yet the truth in the sagas was stranger and sharper. The Jotnar were not mindless beasts. They were kin, lovers, rivals, and sometimes teachers to the gods themselves. They were chaos given flesh, but chaos that could not be cut away, for without it the world would not stand. From the very birth of creation, the Jotnar were present. Ymir, the primal giant, was the first being to stir in the yawning void. From his flesh, the gods built Midgard. From his bones, the mountains. From his blood, the seas that a Viking child would one day sail upon. The gods owed their very world to the death of a giant. And so the pattern was set. War and kinship, enmity and alliance, bound together like threads too tangled to sever. Odin himself took wives among the Jotnar. From such unions came children who would shape the fate of the 9 realms. Thor's mother was of giant blood, making the hammer-wielder half foe and half protector. Skadi, the huntress of the snowy mountains, married Njörður and bound sea to frost. Even the gods, so lofty in Asgard, could not escape the pull of giant kinship. To slay every Jotun would have been to slay themselves. But make no mistake, the Jotnar were also adversaries, and their feuds with the gods shook the bones of Yggdrasil. When a Viking warrior lifted his axe, he knew he stood in the echo of those battles. Frost giants hurled storms at Midgard, fire giants seethed in Muspelheim, and trickster Jotnar bargained or betrayed when least expected. Loki himself, blood brother to Odin and father of monsters, was of giant stock. His mischief and treachery carried that chaotic inheritance, proving that even within the halls of Asgard, the Jotnar's shadow lingered. To the Viking mind, giants were more than foes to be slain. They were necessary adversaries. Without them, Thor's hammer would rest idle, courage would soften, and the great stories would have no teeth. Battle against the Jotnar was not just survival, it was proof of strength, of honour, of the will to stand against the storm even when defeat was certain. For at Ragnarok, it is the giants who will rise as the final tide. Surt will sweep flame across the 9 realms, and Fenrir, son of Loki, will shatter bonds and devour Odin himself. The gods know this. They fight not to destroy the Jotnar, but to keep the balance until the appointed day. In the halls of men, these tales carried weight. A Viking child heard of Thor's endless contests against the Jotnar and learned that enemies must be faced, never ignored. A Viking woman heard of Skadi's fierce marriage bargain and knew that even between rivals there could be alliance, though it brought strife. Farmers, warriors, and jarls alike came to understand that the giants were mirrors of themselves, wild, proud, flawed, yet bound to the same fate. The sagas never painted the Jotnar as simple villains. They were wisdom keepers of the deep earth, guardians of rivers, forgers of treasures, and givers of trials. To feast with a giant could bring strength, to cross one could bring doom. And so the gods walked the knife's edge, sharing blood and bed with their foes, yet never forgetting that from giant hands would one day come the end of all things. In the end, to say giants are people too, is to admit that the Viking world was woven of opposites order and chaos, kinship and feud, creation and destruction. The Jotnar were not outsiders to this tale. They were its heart, beating in defiance of gods and men alike, and without them, no saga would be worth the telling. Monsters as mirrors, this is how the old sagas spoke of trolls, Draugr, and the great beasts of the sea. To the Viking man who set out across storm-lashed waters, or the Viking child who listened by the fire while elders whispered tales, these creatures were never just horrors lurking in the dark. They were reflections of fears, of greed, of broken oaths, of lands untamed. A monster was not merely something to slay, it was a shadow cast by the soul of the people. Trolls dwelt in the wilds, beneath mountains and deep forests where no farmstead could thrive. Their forms shifted with the telling, sometimes hulking brutes with skin like stone, sometimes eerie figures that looked almost human until the moon revealed the truth. They embodied the frontier itself, the danger beyond the ploughed field, the echo of a land that resisted the axe. To a Viking farmer cutting new ground, trolls were not just enemies but warnings: respect the earth, or it will rise against you. And when a Viking child misbehaved, a mother might whisper of trolls snatching the careless, teaching that discipline was as much a shield as sword or wall. The Draugr were darker still. These were not beasts of wilderness, but of the grave. A Draugr was a man once living, now swollen with death, walking again to guard his hoard or punish betrayal. They were greedy even in death, clutching weapons, silver, or Viking food, buried with them. To face a Draugr was to face the truth that greed rots the soul, that dishonour clings long after flesh has gone to soil. Warriors told of Draugr crushing men with corpse strength, but also of the courage needed to strike them down, a reminder that no treasure is worth a cursed afterlife. In this way, the Draugr mirrored the dangers of pride and avarice, teaching by fear what law and oath could not always enforce. And then came the sea beasts, vast shapes beneath the waves. The kraken, coiled and waiting, could drag a ship into the abyss. Serpents wound around cliffs, their eyes glimmering like cold lanterns in the spray. To a Viking sailor rowing into grey mist, these monsters were the embodiment of the ocean's vast indifference. The sea could feed with fish and whales, or it could devour without warning, and no prayer would change its mood. Thus, the sea beasts mirrored the peril of hubris, the folly of thinking a wooden ship and human will could master waters that belonged to gods and giants. Monsters taught lessons, but they also drew boundaries. To cross into Trollland was to tempt chaos. To hoard like a Draugr was to invite curse. To treat the sea as tame was to risk the maw of a kraken. In each tale, the monster was not random, it was moral weather, rising like a storm when men strayed too far from wisdom. Yet there was awe mingled with fear. A Viking man who slew a Draugr earned not just safety, but glory. A sailor who returned from waters where sea serpents swam brought back a tale that bound him tighter to his kin. Even trolls, slain or tricked, became proof that man could wrestle order from wilderness. The monsters tested not only strength, but the worth of character, demanding courage, discipline, and respect for the forces that lay beyond the hearth, fire's glow. In the end, the sagas show us that monsters were never only threats. They were mirrors held up to the Viking world, reminders of greed, of fear, of untamed wilds, of seas that could not be mastered. They revealed that the true struggle was not only against claws and fangs, but against the shadows men carried within themselves. And so, whether in forest, grave, or storm-tossed sea, a monster's gaze was always a question. What kind of man or woman dares face me? Heroes under God skies, the phrase itself carries the weight of the old sagas, where mortal lives were never free from the gaze of the divine. A Viking man raising his axe in battle, or a Viking child hearing tales by the hearth, understood that heroes were not only flesh and blood. They were chosen, tested, and sometimes broken beneath the vast designs of gods who bent the fates of men as easily as the wind bends a sail. Among these heroes stands Sigurd, the dragon slayer, whose name echoed across valleys and seas. Born into tragedy, raised by a smith, guided by the cunning of Odin, Sigurd was no simple warrior. He bathed in the blood of Fafnir, the serpent, and gained the gift of understanding bird song. Yet even with such triumph, the threads of fate pulled him toward betrayal and doom. His strength was his own, but the path he walked was woven by hands older than his. His saga told the Viking child that bravery can carve mountains, yet even the boldest cannot cut the cords the Norns have tied. Then came Ragnar Lothbrok, a name that rolled like thunder across both land and sea. Ragnar was no god, but his deeds brushed the divine. With his cunning raids, his fearless voyages, his storming of foreign shores, he seemed touched by Odin's hunger for glory. Clad in his famed shaggy breeches, Ragnar tested kings, outwitted foes, and sought to carve Midgard into his own saga. Yet his fate, too, lay heavy upon him. Cast into a pit of serpents, he died singing, his voice rising like a storm-wind hymn. The piglets will grow and avenge their father. The gods did not save him. Instead, they bore witness, for his death was seed for the rise of his sons. The sagas show that such heroes walked a narrow path. Their triumphs fed the pride of their people, but their downfall reminded all that men are but sparks beneath God's skies. A Viking man listening to these tales by firelight knew that heroism was not about escaping death. It was about meeting it with open eyes and unbroken voice, so that one's name would never fall silent. Gods meddled, often unseen, in these mortal sagas. Odin whispered wisdom to Sigurd. Thor's storms tested seafarers like Ragnar. Freyja and her Valkyries chose which heroes would rise in Valhalla, drinking mead with the Einherjar until Ragnarok. Even when men acted boldly, their deeds braided with divine agendas, strands of mortal courage twined into the loom of fate. A hero's saga was never his alone. It was always a verse in the larger song of gods, giants, and the end yet to come. These stories mattered because they taught. They reminded every Viking child that courage was more than killing, that fate was not to be feared but to be faced. They taught Viking women that their words, their counsel, could shape the deeds of sons and husbands, as Sigurd was guided by Brynhilde, and as Lagertha fought shoulder to shoulder with Ragnar. Heroes under God skies showed that life was short, fragile, and tested, but glory, if earned, was eternal. So when horns blew and warriors marched, when oaths were sworn and ships cut the waves, it was not only for silver or land. It was to live in the shadow of Sigurd, in the fire of Ragnar, to add a new thread to the tapestry that bound gods and men. For under God's skies, every hero was both pawn and poet, both fleeting ember and eternal flame, reminding the living that courage is the one gift no god can take away. The road to Ragnarok was not a path stumbled upon by chance. It was carved into the bones of creation itself. From the moment Ymir's blood became sea and his skull the dome of the heavens, the ending was seeded in the beginning. Every Viking man who raised his horn in oath, every Viking child who listened wide-eyed to the skalds by the fire, knew that the gods themselves were bound to doom. It was not a question of if the end would come, but when. The signs were whispered long before the first shield clashed. Baldur's death, the Shining One struck down by a dart of mistletoe, was the first crack in Asgard's walls. His passing chilled the halls of the gods, for it was a wound that could not be healed, a promise that even beauty and light would not endure. Mothers wept, and even the stones seemed to sag with sorrow, for Baldur's fall foretold that the world itself would stumble after him. A Viking woman telling this tale to her kin would lower her voice, for it was a truth heavy as winter. If Baldur could die, so too could all. Then came Fimbulvetter, the great winter. Not one season nor three, but 3 winters back to back with no summer between. Snow would fall from every sky, winds would bite without mercy, and the earth would groan beneath frost. Crops would fail, Viking food would dwindle to crumbs and bones. Brothers would turn on brothers, fathers on sons. The bonds of kinship would splinter like ice beneath heavy boots. It was said that wolves would chase the very sun and moon across the sky, and at last devour them, leaving only darkness. Trust, too, would fail. Loki's chains, forged by the wrath of the gods, would break. Fenrir, the wolf-child of that same trickster, would tear loose his bonds and stride across the land with jaws wide enough to swallow the sky. Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, would uncoil from the deep, its thrashing, stirring seas higher than mountains. Even Hel, the silent queen of the dead, would send forth her legions, a grim army that knew neither hunger nor fear. Each was bound to Odin by blood, yet each would rise against him when the final horn sounded. And Heimdall, watchman of Bifrost, would lift Gjallarhorn to his lips and blow. The sound would split earth and sky alike, waking gods, men, and giants to the truth that Ragnarok had come. A Viking child hearing this would shiver, for the horn was no mere signal of battle. it was the cry of the world's last dawn. But if all was fated to end, why tell the tale? Why did Viking men still feast, still fight, still honour their oaths, knowing doom awaited? Because Ragnarok was not only an ending, it was a measure of worth. To stand against the wolf, even knowing it would devour you, to lift shield and axe, though the sea would drown all that was the heart of courage. Glory was not in surviving, but in defiance. The road to Ragnarok was paved with omens, yes, but also with choices. The gods, flawed and fierce, bound themselves to that fate by their bargains and betrayals. Men, hearing these sagas, saw themselves in the reflection. Their lives, too, were brief, tested, and shaped by honour. In the end, Ragnarok was less a tale of despair than a reminder that all things, even the divine, must pass. What mattered was the song sung before the silence. Thus the road was always before them, winter's chill in the air, broken trusts in the halls of men, and omens that whispered of wolves. And yet, under those god skies, the Viking people walked on, fearless, for even the end of worlds could not smother the fire of their spirit. When the world burns, the air itself will tremble as if the sky were splitting in two. The sagas speak of it not as fancy or idle tale, but as certainty whispered into the ears of every Viking child who sat close to the hearth, and roared in the mead halls of Viking men who raised their cups to fate. Ragnarok was not only an end, but the great trial, when fire, frost, gods, and monsters would clash in the last storm of creation. The signs will not be hidden. The wolf Fenrir will break his chains and stride across the world with jaws stretched wide, upper teeth scraping heaven, lower biting earth. The serpent Jormungandr, grown vast in the deep, will uncoil and lash the seas, sending waves higher than mountains, drowning ships and villages. Hell will loose her dead to march beneath banners of rot, and Loki, unbound, will steer Naglfar, the ship made from the nails of the dead, across waters black as pitch. From Muspelheim, Surt will come, a giant wreathed in flame, swinging a sword that blazes brighter than the Sunday. The gods will rally at Vigrid, that plain without end, where all fates are to be decided. Odin himself will ride at the front, clad in helm and mail, spear Gungnir in his hand, ravens wheeling overhead. But even he, the Allfather, knows the cost. Fenrir will meet him there, and though Odin strikes with wisdom and steel, the wolf will swallow him whole. Thor, the hammer-bearer, will face Jormungandr. Viking men told of this fight as the roar of storm against the crash of wave. Mjolnir will crack the serpent's skull, shattering it to pieces, yet Thor will stumble back only 9 steps before the venom sears his veins and he falls. 2 foes, both broken, their deaths locked together like tide and shore. Tyr, god of law, will clash with Garm, the hound of hell. Both will fight with such fury that neither leaves the field alive. Heimdall, golden-toothed watchman of the gods, will face Loki himself. Old enemies twined in fate, they will strike one another down, falling side by side, silence following the echo of Gjallarhorn. Freya, who once gave away his sword for the sake of love, will meet Surt. The green god will stand with courage, but unarmed, he cannot withstand flame, and Surt will strike him down. All the while, Viking warriors of old, the Einherjar, will charge from Valhalla, shields locked, spears raised. Their laughter will mingle with the clash of steel, for they knew from the day they died that this was their purpose. Against them pour giants, trolls, and the legions of hell. The plain of Vigrid will be red with blood, a sea of broken spears and shattered skulls. At the height of this battle, Surt will swing his flaming sword and set the world ablaze. Forests will burn, mountains will split, and the seas themselves will boil. The fire will climb higher than the clouds, until even the stars fall from the sky. Yet in the same breath that flame devours, water will rise to smother it. The great sea will surge over the burning land, swallowing fire and ash alike, leaving only silence and shadow. But silence is not nothing. The sagas tell that after the fire and flood, a new world will rise, green and fair, from the waters. Survivors will walk its fields, and gods reborn will meet again beneath the Sunday. For even when the world burns, the end is also a beginning, and the road of men and gods continues beyond the smoke. Thus the tale was told among Viking men as both terror and promise. When the world burns, so too will glory blaze. And though ash will cover the halls of gods, the spirit of courage, the will to stand even at the end, will outlive the flames. After the clash of gods and giants, when the plain of Vigrid lay drowned in blood and the sea had swallowed fire, there was silence. The air hung heavy, as if the very breath of creation had stopped. Viking men said that even the ravens fell quiet, their wings stilled in the smoke. Yet from that silence, from the ashes of ruin, the sagas spoke of a promise that when all seemed lost, the world would be born again. This was the hope whispered to Viking children, that after Ragnarok there would be a green world after. From the blackened soil the earth would stir. Mountains would rise anew, rivers would flow, and fields would bloom once more with grasses and flowers. The sky would clear, and a new sun, brighter than the old, would climb across the heavens. This sun was said to be the daughter of the one devoured by the wolf, rising in her mother's place, her light, softer yet enduring. She would warm the lands of men and gods alike, banishing the long shadows of fire and frost. But what of humankind? For if the world was drowned, who would remain to see this green dawn? The sagas tell of Lif and Lifthrasir, a woman and a man who hid themselves deep within Hodmimir's wood as flames devoured the world above. There they found shelter in the dew-covered branches, living on the morning moisture and the gifts of the forest. While giants burned, wolves raged, and gods fell, these two clung to life in silence. When the storm passed, they emerged into the newborn light. From them would come the new race of humankind, their children spreading across fields untrodden, their breath carrying the songs of survival. The gods, too, would not be wholly gone, for though Ragnarok swallowed much, not all perished. Balder, the bright, who had been slain by mistletoe and confined to Hel's halls, would return, hand in hand with his blind brother Hother, the one who had unwittingly cast the fatal dart. Their reconciliation was a sign that old wounds, even those carved deepest, could be healed in the new world. With them would come Vidar, silent avenger of Odin, and Vali, son born for vengeance, yet granted peace. Thor's sons, Mothi and Magni, would also rise, bearing their father's hammer, Mjolnir, unbroken and gleaming, a gift to guard the new age. Together, these survivors would gather on Ithavul, a plain untouched by the flood, where once stood the golden halls of Asgard. There they would raise anew the dwellings of the gods, fairer even than before. It was said they would find in the grass the golden tablets the Aesir had played with at the dawn of time, tokens of innocence restored, as though the circle had closed and begun again. For the Viking people, this vision was not merely comfort, but truth carved into their way of life. They knew storms could flatten homes, seas could swallow ships, and kin could be lost without warning. Yet the tale of a green world after reminded them that nothing ends without something beginning. Viking food could run out in winter, but spring always brought green shoots. Fire could raise a hall, but from the embers new timber could be laid. So too would the world itself breathe again. And so the Skalds told it, that after the wolves devoured the sun, after Surt's flame turned the world to ash, after even the gods had fallen, there would still be life. Two humble mortals, the bright god Balder and a quiet new sun, would carry forward what was lost, a promise whispered in ruin that even when the world burns, it is never truly the end. Women, power, and prophecy were threads woven through the tapestry of the Old North, never faint, never hidden, though often whispered rather than shouted. Viking men might wield axe and shield in the clash of raid or battle, but Viking women carried powers that pierced deeper than iron. Their voices shaped kings, their foresight bent fates, and their presence in story and song was never small. To overlook them was to misunderstand the breadth of the sagas themselves. The Volur, seeresses of the Viking age, walked with staffs in hand and spirits at their heels. They wandered from hall to hall, welcomed with honour, for they bore glimpses of what lay beyond the veil. They spoke of harvests, of deaths yet to come, of the tilt of luck in battle. Their words could shape a Viking man's courage or crush it, for to hear fate sung aloud was a weight no warrior could cast aside. The Volur did not belong to hearth or hall, but to the wandering road, cloaked in fur and mystery, feared and revered in equal measure. Yet prophecy was not only theirs. Goddesses themselves breathed foresight. Frigg, queen of Asgard, sat silent while Odin sought wisdom, but her silence was power she knew, she saw, and she bore the pain of knowledge without boasting. The Norns, 3 women at the roots of Yggdrasil, carved runes into the wood of the world tree, measuring the lives of gods and men. They did not ask leave, they did not bow. Even Odin's might bent beneath their weaving. Queens, too, ruled more than halls. Viking women of high rank steered the fates of kingdoms, not with spears, but with marriages, counsels, and the cold clarity of choice. A queen might seal peace with her hand, or shatter it with her vengeance. Saga tells of queens who whispered strategies into the ears of their husbands, and when men faltered, they themselves bore blades into battle. Shield maidens, sung of in both awe and fear, rode alongside Viking men, their armour gleaming, their eyes alight with storm. In ritual, women stood as keepers of the hearth and guardians of the blot. Their hands prepared Viking food for feast and sacrifice. Their voices raised songs to the gods, their blood mixed with the offerings poured into sacred earth. Some bore keys at their belts, the symbol of household power, ruling not only kitchens but wealth, trade, and the running of farms, while men voyaged abroad. A Viking child learned early that his mother's word was as binding as his father's, for it was she who shaped the home and guarded the line. Yet prophecy was never gentle. It weighed heavy. Women in the sagas often carried the burden of foresight that men refused to heed. They spoke of doom before battles, of betrayal before feasts, of winters that would starve the land. Too often, their words were mocked until truth rose bloody on the battlefield, proving them right. To carry such vision was both gift and curse, for to see the thread of fate was to bear sorrow before it arrived. And so, women in the Viking world were not shadows nor ornaments. They were threads of power queens who ruled kingdoms from within the hall. Volur, who read the bones of the future, shield maidens whose spears sang in war, mothers who shaped the strength of sons, daughters whose marriages sealed fates. Their agency was not always seen with the eyes, but it was felt in the marrow of story and saga. For prophecy was not a matter of choice, it was a fire passed from hand to hand. And when Viking men boasted of strength, when gods themselves quarrelled and fell, it was often the voice of a woman, steady, fierce, and unyielding, that marked the turning of the tale. From pagan shore to cross and king, the sagas whisper of a turning tide, when the songs of Odin and Thor were met by the toll of church bells drifting across cold seas. For centuries, Viking men had raised horns to the old gods, offering blood in sacred groves, and feasting on Viking food as the skalds sang of thunder and fate. Yet ships that once carried raiders now bore priests, and swords that once carved kingdoms began to bow before the weight of the cross. It was no sudden conquest, but a long struggle of heart and habit, of law and law. The first priests came as strangers, carrying books instead of blades, but they were met with suspicion. What use had a Viking child for stories of one god, meek and crucified, when his kin had grown on tales of Thor's hammer and Odin's spear? Yet the cross spread not only through preaching, but through the slow grind of politics and promise. Kings saw in the new faith more than salvation. They saw unity, law, and ties to realms beyond the sea. To bow to Christ was also to bind to powerful allies, and so rulers took the cross as crown, dragging their people with them. Still, the old ways did not vanish at once. On pagan shorelines, sacrifices continued in secret. Farmers whispered prayers to Freya for good harvests, even as churches rose upon the hills. A Viking woman might keep a carved Thor's hammer hidden beneath her cloak while carrying a cross in the open. Men swore oaths on both Christ and Odin, hedging their bets between two worlds. The gods did not fade like smoke, they lingered, half hidden, shaping dreams and fears long after priests declared them false. There was compromise too. The holy days of the old gods became woven into the fabric of Christian feasts. The Yule fires that Viking men had kindled in honour of the sun's return burned still, now cloaked in Christ's name. Blot gave way to mass, but the sense of community, the gathering of kin, remained. The sagas tell of chieftains who stood between two altars, one for Christ, one for the Aesir, unwilling to abandon either fully. For a time, the halls of the north carried both psalms and skaldic verse, their voices twined like threads of the same loom. But the shift ran deeper than ritual. Law itself bent. Where once oaths were sworn on Thor's hammer or Odin's ring, now they were bound before the cross. Where once vengeance bled through kinship, now kings claimed the right to rule in God's name, softening feuds with the weight of Christian justice. Yet even here, the old gods cast shadows. Tyr's memory lived in the courts, Odin's wisdom in council, Thor's strength in the pride of warriors who now fought beneath banners stitched with saints. And so the north changed, yet did not. The Viking man still drank mead, still taught his Viking child the value of courage, still sang sagas of gods and giants by the fire. But above him, the church bell tolled, marking hours, bending time to a new order. The gods were not slain, they were transformed, their stories woven into the sagas, even as their temples fell silent. Some became devils in the new tongue, others faded into folklore, wandering hills as echoes. Yet, in the telling of tales, they endured. From pagan shore to cross and king, the world of the north was remade, but never erased. For every church raised upon a burial mound, there was a rune carved in secret. For every prayer spoken to Christ, a whisper still carried to Odin in the dark. And though the cross-crowned kings and carved law into stone, the old gods lingered in blood, in memory, in story, and through story. They never truly died. The afterlives of the old gods are not written in temples of stone, for those were few, nor in scriptures sealed by kings, for none were made. They are written in the soil, in the bones beneath the barrows, in the sagas carried on the lips of Viking men long after their ships had ceased to sail. And still today, Odin, Thor, and Freya walk among us not as deities with blazing eyes, but as echoes, symbols, and companions in story. Their breath lingers in ways neither priest nor conqueror could silence. The earth itself remembers. Archaeologists dig into graves where Viking food was laid beside the dead bread for the journey, mead to quench thirst, and weapons to carve a place in the afterlife. Charred wood from great pyres, amber beads from a Viking child's burial, runes scratched into bone, all whisper of gods who ruled not only life but death. In ship burials, the prow still pointed toward the horizon, sending chieftains and shield maidens to seas beyond the world, guided perhaps by Njortha's waves or Freya's handmaids. These finds speak of faith as practice, not abstraction, a living bond between mortal and divine. But the gods did not remain buried. In the quiet centuries after conversion, they lingered in folk tales told by firelight. Trolls, Draugr, and the hidden folk carried shades of the old powers. A Viking woman who once prayed to Frigg might whisper still of a white lady who blessed childbirth. Farmers in later ages left offerings in their fields to unseen watchers, though the priest frowned. The names of Odin and Thor, once chanted in blot, became curses on stormy nights or blessings muttered when luck was thin. Even disguised, they endured. In time, they found new life in the words of poets and skalds reborn. The Eddas, scratched into vellum by Christian hands, preserved tales meant to be sung in longhouses. Their survival was a paradox, written down to prevent forgetting, yet reshaped by the very faith that sought to erase them. Still, the essence remained. A Viking child who once heard of Thor's hammer over supper has kin, centuries later, who can read the same tales in ink and know the thunder god's laugh. And now, in the age of wandering minds, the old gods walk boldly again. Modern heathenry, the revival of the old ways, raises hofs and groves where mead is poured in honour of the Aesir and Vanir. Viking men and women, distant by blood yet close in spirit, don runes and call to Odin for wisdom, to Thor for strength, to Freya for passion. Their rituals echo the past, not as perfect copies, but as living continuations of a bond never broken. The gods are not relics to them, but companions still. Even beyond faith, the gods stride into the halls of our imagination. They rise in sagas retold, in tales spun by storytellers, in plays, books and song. Thor's hammer, once a sacred ward, worn by Viking warriors, now glimmers in the minds of children as a weapon of heroes. Loki, once whispered of as a dangerous ally, dances again in stories of trickery and charm. Odin, one-eyed wanderer, strides across pages and screens, gathering followers not by oaths of blood, but by the pull of myth itself. The afterlives of the old gods prove that stories do not die. The cross may have crowned kings, but the hammer still thunders in memory. The runes carved in stone may crumble, yet their shapes linger in every telling, every symbol etched anew. Viking men and women carried their gods across seas. Their descendants carry them across centuries. And so long as stories are told, so long as fate and courage and love still matter, Odin and his kin will never be gone. They walk beside us, still in the sagas we retell, in the symbols we wear, and in the fires we light when darkness grows long.